What's the worst thing you can think of? This guy's probably done it and then said he didn't. I'm your host Yusuf, and these are the top 10 chilling things John Wayne Gacy has said. Make sure you subscribe and ring that bell to get notified whenever we upload a new video. Anyways, let's get the clown makeup. Also, side note, I appreciate all of our subscribers. Thank you very much.
Everybody from the neighborhood knew John Gacy.
I was clowning and appearing in at least 10, 15 parades.
Number 10, when he said that some of the identifications of his victims were wrong. I'm not interested in what the public thinks. My fight is in the courts. And while I have been fighting with the appeal, it has been an uphill battle because I am an unpopular cause. Too much public pressure, too much politics. To give me a hearing so that I can prove that the state withheld evidence favorable to me, that the identifications of some of the victims was wrong, and that my attorney was more concerned about book rights and how sensationally more the case could get, the higher the value of the book. Gacy alleges that his attorney only took his defense because he wanted the information about Gacy so that he could put it in a book. He is asking here for another hearing for his case, perhaps to reduce his sentence to something lighter. Gacy's sentence ended up in execution as he was sentenced to capital punishment for his crimes. Number 9, when he said Jeffrey Dahmer was more insane than him. If Jeffrey Dahmer doesn't meet the legal test for insanity, God help the one that does meet it. It has to really be something. If Jeffrey Dahmer doesn't meet it, then nobody does. And for me, it's a psychological ploy to use. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't end up being legally insane. The reason why Jeffrey Dahmer's insanity defense was rejected is because the jury did not see clear and convincing evidence of how Jeffrey Dahmer's mental condition caused him to commit the crimes without understanding the wrongness of his actions. If you are wondering if Gacy himself met the legal test for insanity, here's a quote directly from an official law review from West Virginia University in 1984. Given the psychiatric evaluation of Gacy, neither a criminal sentence nor a program of treatment for a mentally disordered offender may be adequate or appropriate. The case suggests the need to consider the possibility of permanent isolation and incapacitation of dangerous persons who are not treatable nor rehabilitatable, nor properly subject to execution. Number 8, when he was trying to convince the court that he was truly insane or had no knowledge of the crimes committed. No, I don't think that's possible. After 14 years under truth serum, had I committed the crime, I would have known it. There's got to be something that would click in my mind. I've had photos of 21 of the victims, and I've looked at them all over the years here, and I've never recognized any one of them.
The thing of it is, we took it a step further. We went into their backgrounds. I wanted to know where they were at, what schools they attended, who they hung out with, and what kind of activities they were into. And that's what we dug up on each one of the victims. But still, there is no association. None of them never worked for me. None of them, they never went to any places that I ever hung around, because I didn't hang around that many places unless you're involved in politics.
He's lying through his teeth right here. He wants the court to believe that he didn't recognize the victims at all, and thus he couldn't have committed the crimes, or that he was insane for not being able to remember that he committed the slaughters. Whatever he tried here, it failed for him, as we all know. Number 7, when he created a conspiracy against the state of Illinois. If you're talking about the Summerdale house and the bodies found there, we feel that some of them passed of substance overdose, then were buried alive. Trouble is, the state never did toxicology on the victims, as they wouldn't fit their theory that they were all strangled. Even Dr. Stein says that the 13 passed of suffocation and 10 were left undetermined, which leads me to believe that they were not terminated the way the state wants you to believe. The state of Illinois had a running theory that Gacy strangled all of his victims, which Gacy denied vehemently. I'm not sure if he's denying the cause of execution for the 10 other victims to reduce his sentence or to say he's innocent. If you know, then let us know in the comments below. Number 6, when he said the public was brainwashed. Keep in mind, the public has been brainwashed, and nearly 80% of what is known about me is fantasy and self-serving theories of the state. But overall, I'm an embarrassment of the justice system, because if I am right, then they are wrong, and the butchers are still out there. For political reasons, it would be better that I drop out of life. Then they could all say what a great job they've done, and nobody else would be pushing for the truth to come out.
People don't want to know the truth and the honesty of it. If they want to be convinced or brainwashed into what they believe, then fine, then go ahead and kill me. But vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, because you will have executed somebody that didn't commit the crime.
Another conspiracy from Mr. Gacy. At this point, he might really be insane, but it's better that he wasn't sentenced for insanity because this guy really did some awful things. Number 5. When he explained why he marked the spot in the garage where some of the bodies were hidden. Yes, I marked the spot in the garage. When I was back at the house on December 22nd, they had asked me to. With all the rebuilding of the garage, which was the last area of concrete, in the last area where the concrete was poured, and they handed me an orange spray can and I put an X. That's it. An X over the spot in the corner of the garage where I thought the last area was poured. Now all of a sudden, Kunkel claims that I not only drew an X, but I put an O on top of it, where the head was, and made that X look like it was a stick figure. And that's not true. Gacy buried Butkovich's body under his garage. He then took the teen's car and left it in a parking lot with Butkovich's keys and wallet sitting out in the front seat. Butkovich's parents were convinced that Gacy was involved in the boy's disappearance and called police at least once a week for nearly 2 years, urging them to investigate Gacy. Had the police followed the Butkovich's instructions, the lives of at least 30 other young men and teenage boys could have been spared. Unfortunately for the victims, the cops hadn't put in any effort in finding the bodies. Number 4, when he talked about whether or not there was an odor in the Somerville house. This one's kinda gross. There was no smell. Over the years, other than when it rained, the musty odor was present. People were in and out of that house daily for years, and other than when it rained, there was no odor, and certainly not like what some of the books said. That's all fantasy. If that odor was there, somebody would have noticed it sooner.
29 bodies buried in that house of his on Summerdale, a crime of horrendous proportions. In the crawl space underneath, bodies covered with lime and encased in plastic, dug up a few days before Christmas and carried into the December cold, one after another after another.
When his second wife, Carol, whom he divorced in 1975, would complain about the smell emanating from beneath their home, he would chalk it up to some sewage issue, enlisting workers at his contracting company to spread hundreds of pounds of lime in the crawl space in an effort to conceal the stench. The stench was actually one of the main reasons he was caught, because his neighbors kept complaining about it. Number 3, when he explained that other people had keys to his rental house. Yes, that's true, but the house wasn't a home. Like what you go to a home to every night. The Summerdale house is rented to PDM contractors. There was 12 keys out to it, but that was never allowed to come out at the trial, as it would put doubt in the state's theory. They didn't want anybody to know that people had keys to the house. Plus the fact that I wasn't always at the house, so others used it just as much. And again, that wasn't brought out at the trial as it didn't fit the state's theory of the case that I committed all the crimes. If 11 people had access to the home, how come no one else complained about the smell? It's actually very strange in my opinion. Number 2, when he denied he ever confessed. That is what has been said in the media and at the trial. To this day, nobody has produced one. There is no written confession. There is no tape recorded confession. There is no police stenographer typed confession. It was in my appeal and the court refused to look at it and the state refused to answer it. If they had nothing to hide, I can't understand why they can't produce one. It's interesting that he says he never confessed when on December 22nd, 1978, John Wayne Gacy confessed to police to ending over 24 young men and burying their bodies under his suburban Chicago home. Maybe he was just joking when he confessed. Number 1, when he implied that he didn't work alone. It wasn't in the state's best interest to let the jury know. They said it would raise doubt that John Gacy acted alone. The defense attorneys didn't bring it out because it didn't go along with their insanity defense, showing others were involved. A lot came to light in John Wayne Gacy's trial. The garage where he kept the bodies of the victims, the implication of another person being involved, so much to follow and keep track of that it kind of gets convoluted. Well, at least we know that justice was indeed served. This guy is probably the most evil person ever. Seriously, I can't wait to share the things this dude said. I'm your host Yusuf, and these are the top 10 chilling things H.H. Holmes has said. Make sure you subscribe and ring that bell to get notified whenever we upload a new video. Anyways, let's talk. Number 10, his confession. While he was confessing to his crimes, H.H. Holmes said this: "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a butcher, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing. I was born with the evil one standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world, and he has been with me since." Whoa, that's intense. But wait, who is this guy anyways? Well, let me give you the lowdown. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or H.H. Holmes, was an American con artist and serial executioner, the subject of more than 50 lawsuits in Chicago alone. Until his execution in 1896, he chose a career of crime, including insurance fraud, swindling, check forging, 3 to 4 bigamous illegal marriages, horse theft, and termination. Despite his confession of 27 terminations, including some people who were verifiably still alive, while waiting execution, Holmes was convicted and sentenced to execution for only one slaughter, that of accomplice and business partner Benjamin Petezel. It is believed he ended 3 of the Petezel's offspring, as well as 3 other mistresses, the offspring of one of his mistresses and the sister of another. Holmes was executed on May 7, 1896, 9 days before his 35th birthday. Number 9. When he basically said people are too stupid for him. While with a police officer being interrogated, Holmes just went out and said, "I will not pass away by the hand of man," which is a pretty confident thing to say while being interrogated and then later confessing to 27 executions. Let's take a deeper dive into his early life, shall we? Holmes was born as Herman Webster Mudgett in Gilmanton, New Hampshire on May 16, 1861, to Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price, both of whom were descended from the first English immigrants in the area. Mudgett was his parents' third-born child. He had an older sister Ellen, an older brother Arthur, a younger brother Henry, and a younger sister Mary. Holmes' father was from a farming family, and at times he worked as a farmer, trader, and house painter. His parents were devout Methodists. Later attempts to fit Holmes into the pattern seen in modern serial executioners have described him torturing animals and suffering from abuse at the hands of a violent father, but contemporary and eyewitness accounts of his childhood do not provide proof of either. Number 8. When he expressed how it felt to be an evil person. While talking to a doctor, Holmes said, "It's fun to be a butcher," which is pretty creepy. Holmes arrived in Chicago in August 1886, which is when he began using the name H.H. Holmes. He came across Elizabeth S. Holton's pharmacy at the northwest corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street in Englewood. Holton gave Holmes a job, and he proved to be a hard-working employee, eventually buying the store. Holmes purchased an empty lot across from the pharmacy where construction began in 1887 for a 2-story mixed-use building, with apartments on the second floor and retail spaces including a new pharmacy. A creditor of Holmes, named John DeBroyle, passed away of apoplexy on April 17, 1891 in the pharmacy. When Holmes declined to pay the architects or the steel company, Aetna Iron and Steel, they sued in 1888. In 1892, he added a 3rd floor, telling investors and suppliers he intended to use it as a hotel during the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition, though the hotel portion was never completed. In 1892, the hotel was somewhat completed with 3 stories and a basement. The ground floor was the storefront. Fictionalized accounts report that Holmes constructed the hotel to lure in tourists visiting the nearby World's Fair in order to remove them and sell their skeletons to medical schools. There is no evidence that Holmes ever tried to lure strangers into his hotel to end them, and in fact, none of his likely victims were strangers. Holmes did have a history of selling cadavers to medical schools. However, he acquired his wares through grave robbing rather than execution. That's much better. No moral issues there. Number 7. When he talked about insane people. Holmes used to work at an insane asylum, but was driven away from it. What did he have to say about his experience? Well, this was my first experience with insane persons, and so terrible was it that for years afterwards, even now sometimes, I see their faces in my sleep. So in reality, Holmes is just a big scaredy cat, huh? Speaking of insane asylums, want to know where he went to university? Well, in 1882, he entered the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery and graduated in June 1884 after passing his exams. While enrolled, he worked in the anatomy lab under Professor William James Herdman. He was then the chief anatomy instructor, and the two were said to have been engaged in facilitating grave robbing to supply medical cadavers. Holmes had apprenticed in New Hampshire under Nom Wright, a noted advocate of human dissection. Years later, when Holmes was suspected of being a butcher and claimed to be nothing but an insurance fraudster, he admitted to using cadavers to defraud life insurance companies several times in college. Gotta pay for the education somehow. Number 6, when he admitted how he would put people under. To end his victims and put them 6 feet under, Holmes said this to a Chicago paper: "I would give them potassium cyanide. Potassium cyanide releases hydrogen cyanide gas, a highly toxic chemical asphyxiant that interferes with the body's ability to use oxygen. Exposure to potassium cyanide can be rapidly fatal. It has whole body effects, particularly affecting those organ systems most sensitive to low oxygen levels: the central nervous system, or the brain, the cardiovascular system, the heart and blood vessels, and the pulmonary system, the lungs. Potassium cyanide is used commercially for fumigation, electroplating, and extracting gold and silver from ores. Hydrogen cyanide gas released by potassium cyanide has a distinctive bitter almond odor. Others describe a musty old sneaker smell, but a large proportion of people cannot detect it. The odor does not provide adequate warning of hazardous concentrations." Number 5, when he explained how his hotel had to work. "My idea is right. It will work. It must work." Holmes had said this about his hotel. Reports by the Yellow Press labeled the building as Holmes's execution castle, claiming the structure contained secret torture chambers, trapdoors, gas chambers, and a basement crematorium. None of these claims were actually true, though. Other accounts claimed that the hotel was made up of 100 rooms and laid out like a maze, with doors opening into brick walls, windowless rooms, and dead-end staircases. In reality, the hotel floor was moderately sized and largely unremarkable. It did contain some hidden rooms, but they were used for hiding furniture Holmes bought on credit and did not intend to pay for. The hotel was gutted by a fire started by an unknown arsonist shortly after Holmes was arrested, but was largely rebuilt and used as a post office until 1938. Besides his infamous execution castle, Holmes also had a one-story factory which he claimed was to be used for glass bending. It is unclear if the factory furnace was ever used for glass bending, because it was speculated to have been used to destroy incriminating evidence of Holmes's crimes. Number 4, when he explains his guilt. "There are none who do not believe I am guilty. I admit it freely. There are many with whom I could have lived happily, but those who know me only from what I have said and done in my confession would dread to associate with me. I am a monomaniac on the subject of ending people, and I have no desire for any peace of mind. I do not wish to be at large, and if it were not for that detective who was still in search of me, I would run my head against the first stone wall in sight." Holmes's termination spree finally ended when he was arrested in Boston on November 17, 1894, after being tracked there from Philadelphia by the private Pinkerton National Detective Agency. He was held on an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas because the authorities had become more suspicious at this point, and Holmes appeared poised to flee the country in the company of his unsuspecting third wife. In July 1895, following the discovery of 2 people's bodies, Chicago police and reporters began investigating Holmes's building in Englewood, now locally referred to as the Castle. Though many sensational claims were made, no evidence was found which could have convicted Holmes in Chicago. According to Seltzer, stories of torture equipment found in the building are 20th century fiction. Number 3, when he said he was turning into the devil. "I'm convinced that since my imprisonment, I have changed woefully and gruesomely from what I was formerly in feature and figure. My head and face are gradually assuming an elongated shape. I believe fully that I am growing to resemble the devil, that the similitude is almost completed." With insurance companies pressing to prosecute him for arson, Holmes left Chicago in July 1894. He reappeared in Fort Worth, where he had inherited property from the Williams sisters, at the intersection of modern-day Commerce Street and 2nd Street. Here, he once again attempted to build an incomplete structure without paying his suppliers and contractors. This building was not a site of any additional removals. In July 1894, Holmes was arrested and briefly jailed for the first time on the charge of selling mortgaged goods in St. Louis, Missouri. He was promptly bailed out, but while in jail, he struck up a conversation with a convicted outlaw named Marion Hedgepeth, who was serving a 25-year sentence. Holmes had concocted a plan to swindle an insurance company out of $10,000 by taking out a policy on himself and then faking his own passing. Number 2, when he described his love of fire. "I've always found something peculiarly fascinating about fire, about its mysterious power and its destructive range. I've had such a liking for fire that I have frequently started conflagrations." Holmes promised Hedgepeth a $500 commission in exchange for the name of a lawyer who could be trusted. Holmes was directed to a young St. Louis attorney named Jephthah Howe. Howe thought Holmes' scheme was brilliant and agreed to play a part. Nevertheless, Holmes' plan to fake his own passing failed when the insurance company became suspicious and refused to pay. Holmes did not press the claim. Instead, he concocted a similar plan with Petezel. While working in the Chemical Bank building on Dearborn Street, Holmes met and became close friends with Benjamin Petezel, a carpenter with a criminal past who was exhibiting in the same building a coal bin he had invented. Holmes used Petezel as his right-hand man for several criminal schemes. A district attorney later described Petezel as Holmes' tool, his creature. Petezel agreed to fake his own passing so that his wife could collect on a $10,000 life insurance policy, which she was to split with Holmes and Howe. The scheme, which was to take place in Philadelphia, called for Petezel to set himself up as an inventor under the name B.F. Perry, and then be ended and disfigured in a lab explosion. Holmes was to find an appropriate cadaver to play the role of Petezel. Instead, Holmes removed Petezel by knocking him unconscious with chloroform and setting his body on fire with the use of benzene. In his confession, Holmes implied Petezel was still alive after he used chloroform on him, before he set him on fire. However, forensic evidence presented at Holmes' later trial showed chloroform had been administered after Petezel's passing, presumably to fake taking his own life to exonerate Holmes should he be charged with execution. Number 1. His last words. This is my favorite part. I get to tell you what they said just before justice is served. Well, Holmes said this: "Take your time, don't bungle it." Don't know what bungle means, but okay. In October 1895, Holmes was put on trial for the termination of Benjamin Petezel, and was found guilty and sentenced to execution. Following his conviction, Holmes confessed to 27 slaughters in Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto, and 6 attempted slaughters. Holmes was paid $7,500 by the Hearst newspapers in exchange for his confession, which was quickly found to be mostly nonsense. While writing his confessions in prison, Holmes mentioned how drastically his facial appearance had changed since his imprisonment. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing Prison, also known as the Philadelphia County Prison, for the slaughter of Petezel. Until the moment of his passing, Holmes remained calm and amiable, showing very few signs of fear, anxiety, or depression. Despite this, he asked for his coffin to be contained in cement and buried 10 feet deep, because he was concerned grave robbers would steal his body and use it for dissection. Holmes' neck did not break. He instead strangled until his passing slowly, twitching over 15 minutes before being pronounced gone 20 minutes after the trap had sprung. Last words are a lot like high school quotes. They're the only thing people you probably won't ever see again will have to remember you by. I'm your host Yusuf, and these are 10 chilling last words by an inmate. Make sure to subscribe and ring that bell to get notified whenever we upload a new video. Anyways, let's get wordy. At number 10, Jimmy Glass. Jimmy was a high school dropout with a criminal record in Arkansas. In December 1982, Jimmy and another inmate, Jimmy Wingo, escaped from jail and went on to execute elderly couple Newt and Earlene Brown at their home on Christmas Eve. The Brown's son, Gary Lamar Brown, was the son-in-law of Judge Charles A. Marvin of the Louisiana Court of Appeal for the Second Circuit, based in Shreveport. Glass and Wingo were soon arrested. Both were sentenced to execution in the electric chair. Before being electrocuted, Jimmy Glass was asked for his last words. He replied with this: "I'd rather be fishing," which is so far removed from his situation that his sanity should probably be called into question. Though, to be fair, I guess fishing is better than being electrocuted. At number 9, Jeffrey David Matthews. Jeffrey David Matthews had his execution postponed 3 times, twice by the governor of Oklahoma to further investigate his claims of innocence, and once due to the controversy surrounding the substances they were going to administer to him. Matthews was indicted for the 1994 execution of his great-uncle, Otis Earl Short, after he and an accomplice robbed his home. Matthews shot Short in the back of the head and slit his wife's throat, but she managed to survive. His last words were in reference to the Oklahoma governor. "I think that governor's phone is broke. He hadn't called yet," he said before his execution. At number 8, George Apple. John George Apple was an Australian politician, lawyer, and farmer. He served from 1908 to 1929 as a delegate for the electoral district of Albert, and from 1909 to 1915 as the Secretary of Mine and Public Works, and Home Secretary of Queensland. Apple was convicted of the heinous crime that is execution in the first degree, although little is actually known about said execution. While being strapped into the electric chair, George Apple found the situation suddenly humorous, laughing during the tightening of his restraints. His last words were this: "Well, gentlemen, you are about to see a baked apple." These words quickly spread through the public and became more remembered than his actual crime. At number 7, Robert Charles Towery. Robert Charles Towery was executed through lethal injection, which is ironic considering he was charged for injecting battery acid into his victim before strangling him to execution in a 1991 robbery. That's a bit extreme. The victim was a philanthropist who loaned money to Towery on several occasions and used him as his mechanic, which is, I'm pretty sure, the definition of don't bite the hand that feeds. During Towery's last moments, he apologized to the victim's family and cursed his bad mistakes. His last words are, "I love my family, potato, potato, potato." The potato reference was a secret message to his nephew. It is a sound that a Harley-Davidson motorcycle makes while the engine is idle, and is a way of saying that everything is okay. At number 6, George Engel. George Engel was an immigrant from Germany who had lost faith in the political process and joined the International Working People's Association. In 1886, a big rally filled to the brim of raging anarchists and labor activists turned violent when a makeshift explosive device was thrown at the police there at the time. The explosion sent 7 people to an early grave. Although nobody could figure out who threw the bottle, and Engel was at home playing cards at the time of the explosion, he took the fall for his anarchist brethren and was convicted of execution, subsequently sending him to the gallows. Before being hung, these were his last words: "Hurrah for anarchy! This is the happiest moment of my life." At number 5, Patrick Bryan Knight. In 1991, Patrick Bryan Knight and an accomplice hunted down and kidnapped their next-door neighbors. The 2 perpetrators locked the neighbors in their basement, and the following night, Patrick Bryan Knight blindfolded them, drove them to a secluded area where no one was looking, and shot the neighbors. While waiting for his execution, Patrick Knight used a website, forums, and mail to ask for the best jokes he could use for a final statement. He decided to name several inmates he believed were innocent and used his own joke. "Not all of us are innocent, but those are. I said I was going to tell a joke. Demise had set me free. That's the biggest joke. I deserve this. And the other joke is that I am not Patrick Bryan Knight, and y'all can't stop this execution now. Go ahead, I'm finished." At number 4, Sarah Good. Good was accused of witchcraft on March 6, 1692, when Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Parris, related to the Reverend Samuel Parris, claimed to be bewitched under her hand. The young girls asserted that they had been bitten, pinched, and otherwise abused. They would have fits in which their bodies would appear to involuntarily convulse, their eyes rolling back into their heads and their mouths hanging open. When the Reverend Samuel Parris asked, "Who torments you?" the girls eventually shouted out the names of 3 townspeople: Tituba, Sarah Osborne, and Sarah Good. Sarah Good was sent to burn, her last words being this: "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." At number 3, Douglas Roberts. Douglas Roberts claimed he was stoned out of his mind when he robbed and took out Jerry Velez in San Antonio, Texas on May 18, 1996. In a videotaped interview with police, Roberts gave a complete confession stating that he repeatedly stabbed Velez and then ran over the victim's body with his car. A jury convicted Roberts of capital execution in January 1997. "I've been hanging around this popsicle stand way too long. I want to tell you all. When I go, bury me deep. Lay 2 speakers at my feet, put some headphones on my head, and rock and roll me when I'm gone. I'll see you in heaven someday." Roberts said with a smile seconds before the lethal substances were administered on April 20th, 2005. At number 2, Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was one of the most vicious and remorseless criminals to have ever walked the earth, as he was a convicted serial executioner, arsonist, and burglar in the 1920s. In fact, in his own words, he wrote, "In my lifetime, I have removed 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry." Ready for his last words? "Hurry it up, you hosier bastard. I could hang a dozen men while you're screwing around. Wow, this guy is a certified menace. At number 1, Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer was most notably the Milwaukee cannibal. The man removed 17 men from the earth to satisfy his sick and twisted thirst for blood. He then consumed some of them and even performed wicked experiments on his victims. Jeffrey was a disturbed man, often beaten as a child and neglected. He performed his first atrocity when he picked up a hitchhiker and took him somewhere under the guise of inhaling substances. He then hit the man in the head with a weight and disposed of him. His final words was said just before he got his comeuppance from a fellow prisoner in 1994. "I don't care if I live or not. Go ahead and remove me," he said before being beaten to expiration. Interviews are the easiest way to get a good grasp on someone's personality, but what happens when you take it too far? I'm your host Yusuf, and these are the top 10 chilling interviews with convicts. Make sure to subscribe and ring that bell to get notified whenever we upload a new video. Anyways, let's get an interview. At number 10, Charles Manson. The gold standard for Manson media misadventures has to be that time Geraldo Rivera sat down with the man himself back in 1988. Things start off innocent enough, with Manson stating his desire to end 50 million people and proclaiming a dictator was only trying to bring order to the world.
You want to kill 50 million people? Well, that's just a drop in the bucket to what's really coming.
But it's not long before Chucky Boy starts getting fairly belligerent, at one point asking the interviewer how he would like it if he hopped over there and beat the dog poo out of him. After that, Manson goes on a long tirade about how much he hates Susan Atkins, his admiration for Bing Crosby, his personal stabbing technique, he claims he cuts a little but has never stuck it in, why a smoky substance should be legal, and how his exploits in the 60s came this close to resurrecting Jesus. And for that grand finale, he claims Ronald Reagan personally planted evidence on him and tells Geraldo he likes his boots. I'd be terrified if I were him. At number 9, Jeffrey Dahmer. In this interview, Dahmer shows just how crazy he is. In an interview with Inside Edition, which first appeared in 1993, Dahmer discusses his modus operandi, or method of operation, in an extremely calm way. He describes how he got a surge of energy whenever he experienced sawing off limbs in his grandmother's basement, and says it was nearly euphoric. He tells the interviewer that he took photos of the deceased to preserve their physical beauty. He then explains how he started having fantasies about executing people when he was very young, then explains lethargically how a human heart tastes. Oh, and he brought a human head to work one day, just because he could. At number 8, Ted Bundy. Just hours before Ted Bundy was executed in 1989, he sat down for a final interview with Focus on the family founder James Dobson. Bundy, who confessed to ending the lives of 30 women, but his total removal count may exceed 100 victims, used the TV time to explain away his gruesome misdeeds on, what else, watching too much adult films. Instead of taking responsibility for his own actions, Bundy played Dobson, considered by many to be the father of modern-day conservative evangelical movement, like a fiddle, claiming the sinister X-rated entertainment literally possessed him and drove him to an insane urge to end lives. Number 7, Richard Ramirez. In the mid-1980s, Richard Ramirez terrorized Southern California with a string of gruesome home invasion executions. After ending 13 people, the so-called Night Stalker was sentenced to execution, which in his case came in the form of succumbing to a terminal illness while waiting on the to execute list in 2013. In a rare interview with Inside Edition, Ramirez smiles like a maniac when the interviewer asks him why he felt the need to break into people's houses and beat the tenants to their demise with tire irons, aloofly stating, "No comment, I cannot answer at this time." At number 6, John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy sat down with reporter Walter Jacobson for an extremely rare interview. His intent? Well, he wanted to let the world know that he was framed. In the feeble attempt to garner himself a new trial before his date with the lethal injection needle, Gacy proceeded to spit out one lie after the other, stating, among other brass-balled mistruths, that he had undergone 5 hours of truth serum assisted lie detector tests and he didn't believe in physically punishing disobedient children, proving himself to be the absolute least qualified person in human history to ever provide legal defense. Gacy at one point slips up during the interview, telling the interviewee that one of his victims was, and I quote, "not one that I executed." Alas, you can't slight Gacy's quick wit. At number 5, Stephen McDaniel. Compared to the rest of the heavy hitters on this list, Stephen McDaniel is definitely a lightweight. Still, he's worthy of inclusion on the list because, unlike everyone else on this countdown, he had the honor of being interviewed live by a television news crew before he was convicted of anything, or even arrested for that matter. Alas, it was during that interview that McDaniel found out that police had discovered the remains for his neighbor, which he executed, and you can practically pinpoint the moment of the video in which his mask of sanity shatters into a million billion pieces. Shortly after the interview aired, McDaniel confessed to executing his neighbor. Following a plea bargain, he was sentenced to life in prison for his grisly doings. At number 4, Ed Kemper. Kemper sent at least 10 individuals to their graves, including his mother and both paternal grandparents, and earned the nickname the Co-Ed Butcher due to his predilection for targeting female college students in California. Believed to have an IQ in the genius range, you can certainly tease out the distressing coherence from the confirmed cannibal in this 1991 interview, in which he lays out precisely how and why he turned to executing strangers as a recreational activity, describing how he used to drive around picking up hitchhikers as practice for disarming soon-to-be victims. Terrifying. Number 3, Gary Ridgway. The name Gary Ridgway may not ring a bell at first. That's primarily because he's better known as the Green River Executioner, who between 1982 and 1998 removed at least 4 dozen women in the Pacific Northwest, although he confessed to 70 and may be responsible for 90 plus. In this undated interview, presumably it happened somewhere between his arrest in 2001 and his record-breaking 49 counts multiple executions conviction in 2003, Ridgway spent a majority of his time talking about how mean and spiteful his mother was, which he said convinced him into stabbing his schoolmates and torturing small animals in his youth. At number 2, Otis Toole. Colloquially known as the Jacksonville Cannibal, Otis Toole is probably best known for 2 things. First, his chummy relationship with fellow serial executioner Henry Lee Lucas, and being officially named as the man who abducted, removed, and decapitated the son of America's Most Wanted host, John Walsh. While Toole bragged to officials about ending the lives of scores of victims, he was only charged with 2 slangs, with another 4 executions added to his mega super duper life sentence in 1991. In this interview from 1993, the man who fancied himself some arson alongside his grave robbing begins by talking about his pyromaniac desire to watch an entire city burn. And finally, at number 1, Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos is the infamous Florida street worker who over the course of 2 years shot and executed 7 men. In this interview recorded just hours before she received the lethal injection in 2002, Wuornos wastes no time at all as she starts claiming that she's been subject to supersonic weaponry torture since the late 1990s. Then she says the prison was intentionally giving her food poisoning and helicopters were chasing her before she was even arrested for her string of executions. Then she says she can't wait to pass away because she'll be beamed up Star Trek style to explore the cosmos, and that she feels sorry for us because we're all going to get nuked by a comet in 2019. Clearly, she was wrong. Theodore Robert Bundy was a terrible man, a lunatic even. Today, come with me as we explore Ted Bundy and his psyche. I'm your host Yusuf, and these are the top 10 chilling things that Ted Bundy has said. Press on the subscribe button and ring that bell too so you get notified every time we upload a new video. Anyways, let's look into the past. Number 10. I haven't blocked out the past. I wouldn't trade the person I am, or what I've done, or the people I've known for anything. So I do think about it. And at times, it's a rather mellow trip to lay back and remember. Ted Bundy is notoriously a ruthless man. Even in this quote, he seems to be thinking fondly about his executions. One of the biggest ways to identify someone as having sociopathic tendencies is to determine their relationship to feelings and emotions. When Bundy says it's a rather mellow trip to lay back and remember, he isn't talking about some trip to Florence or something. He's talking about the ecstatic feeling when he committed the executions. He feels nothing but mellow for the crimes he's committed. This is reinforced in number 9. I don't feel guilty for anything. I feel sorry for people who feel guilt. This proves that Ted Bundy is remorseless. A person who is remorseless doesn't feel any guilt. If you're remorseless, you don't feel bad at all, even if you've done something terrible. When someone is remorseless, that person has no feeling of pity for people who have been hurt. The night before his execution, Bundy confessed to 30 of his crimes, but the true total remains unknown. Published estimates have run as high as 100 or more, and Bundy occasionally made cryptic comments to encourage that speculation. He told Ainsworth in 1980 that for every execution publicized, there could be one that was not. When FBI agents proposed a total tally of 36, Bundy responded, "Add 1 digit to that, and you'll have it." It seemed like Bundy had no care for anything, turning the entire tragedy into a game for the FBI and the public. Both have called him evil before. He didn't believe he was. At number 8, Ted Bundy said this: "Society wants to believe it can identify evil people, or bad or harmful people, but it's not practical. There are no stereotypes." This quote is like a twisted and malformed version of the classic idiom, "the world isn't black or white." When Bundy says there are no stereotypes, he is trying to shame the media. The public who scorns him detests his very existence. He shames the articles depicting him as the devil or as an evil person. Think about that for a moment. Ted Bundy, infamous executioner, bringer of self-righteous despair, feels so little for his actions that he is shaming the people who identify him as evil. Another interesting facet of this quote is him saying, "It's not practical." Of course, any common sociopath doesn't feel guilt or remorse. Instead, they think in practicality. It's them or me. At number 7, what's one less person on the face of the earth anyways? With this quote, it's easy to derive what Bundy thought about what he was doing. In the United States, between the years 1974 and 1978, 16,131,855 people were recorded as born. Those years are significant, as those are the years Bundy was active. He knew how many people were born every day. He knew they had ties to families and friends. He just didn't care. In the grand scheme of things, to him, it was just one life out of billions. Millions of people pass away each year, each month, each day. What's one more? In a vast universe, millions of galaxies and systems and stars and planets, what could the effect of one man with a knife produce? Why would it matter? To him, it doesn't matter. At number 6, execution is not just a crime of lust or violence. It becomes possession. They are part of you. The victim becomes a part of you, and you two are forever one. And the grounds where you remove them or leave them become sacred to you, and you will always be drawn back to them. This explanation is especially interesting as it might have revealed something about the thought processes of other criminals of the same caliber. Many criminals are arrested or found at the scene of the crime or around it. It seems Bundy was right about that. It's a sacred place, the place where you permanently implemented someone into your story. At number 5, those of us who have been so much influenced by violence in the media, in particular adult media violence, are not some kinds of inherent monsters. We're your sons, and we are your husbands, and we grew up in regular families. And adult media can reach out and snatch a kid out of any house today. It snatched me out of my home 20, 30 years ago. Interestingly, Bundy actually blames adulterated content for how he turned out, though I suppose it makes sense why he blamed that instead of himself. After all, to him, it could never be himself. Addiction to adult content has been rising in recent times, and nowadays there are resources to help quell the urges. However, back in the 60s and 70s, it was most likely very stigmatized by society. At number 4, when you feel the last bit of breath leaving their body, you're looking into their eyes. A person in that situation is God. Bundy made it clear how intimate he feels with the victim before, after, and during his execution of them. Narcissistic personality disorder, the proper term for some who have a God complex, is a rare mental disorder characterized by an inflated sense of self-importance, entitlement, a deep need for admiration, and an alarming lack of empathy for other people. Executioners like Bundy see themselves as better than everyone else, thinking of themselves as gods amongst men, worthy of taking out anyone who opposes them. These are the most dangerous people in the world, the ones that believe they run it. At number 3, I don't think anybody doubts whether I've done some bad things. The question is what, of course, and how, and maybe even most importantly, why? It seems Bundy contradicts his previous quote, the one where he says, society wants to believe it can identify evil people, or bad or harmful people, but it's not practical. He outright admits to have done bad things, which raises more questions than answers. He again toys with the interviewer, asking questions to the interviewer from a third-person perspective of himself. These really are the most important questions, but Bundy has no real intention of answering them in this interview. Aside from that, perhaps Bundy believes that society has no right to call individuals bad people or evil, and it is left up to the individual to decide that for themselves. Either way, Bundy admits to doing bad things. At number 2, I understand now a lot of stuff about myself that I didn't understand then. It makes me realize what was going on. The senselessness of it appalls me, although I'm sure not so much as those who were so close to it. This quote is confusing for several reasons. He states how the senselessness of it all appalled him, but does that mean he is remorseful and regretting of his actions? Or is he referring to how convoluted his executions were, wishing he'd been cleaner with them? I interpret this as him noticing how close to the electric chair he truly is, wishing he had been a better and more efficient criminal. I believe Bundy wanted to do more with his life and less in others. At number 1. After his last meal, steak and eggs, Bundy was sent to the parish chamber on the morning of January 24th, 1989. When asked if he had any last words, he said, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." After that, he was executed via the electric chair. Jim Coleman was Bundy's defense attorney, and Fred Lawrence was his minister. They had both spent a considerable amount of time with Ted Bundy. The story of Ted Bundy is one of tragedy and insanity, one that I hope isn't recreated in the future. Stay safe out there. Like the video if you like the video, drop a comment, and we'll see you next time.